All right, Shakespeare's Macbeth, a tragedy in 5 acts. There's all sorts of really cool lines. But what I wanted to challenge myself to do is try to figure out if I could do Macbeth in about 5 lines. I think I'm going to have to do six, um, but the goal was five. Um, all right, if you know nothing about the play, the synopsis is super helpful. Just this first part is probably enough. Macbeth, set primarily in Scotland, mixes witchcraft, prophecy, and murder. Three weird sisters appear to Macbeth and his comrade Banquo after a battle and prophecy that Macbeth will be king and that the descendants of Banquo will also reign. When Macbeth arrives at his castle, he and Lady Macbeth plot to assassinate King Duncan, soon to be their guest, so that Macbeth can become king. Here are the highlights for me. These three witches appear to Macbeth and Banquo, uh, two captains in the army, in the Scottish army, and they tell them that Macbeth is going to become king and that Banquo is going to have a long line of kings. Macbeth then writes to Lady Macbeth this letter. It's a really cool scene. She reads it and she essentially says, "Great, we're going to make sure this happens. This has been promised to you." And there's all sorts of really interesting things about her doubting whether or not Macbeth can actually go through with it. Um, so she kind of gets in his ear, to say the very least, to kill Duncan. Everything that happens from there is sort of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth trying to hold on um, to the crown. And of course, the synopsis does the whole thing, but that's probably enough for a setup there. All right, here are my 5 lines. I'm going to say that it's 5 lines with this little loophole at the beginning. When I teach this, I think every single time I debate whether or not to say this at the beginning or to just kind of teach through it and then come back to this and highlight this. Um, but I often will say, whether I do it at the beginning or I do it at the end, that these are some of the most important words in the whole play. And they're literally the very first words. They're not even words in the play. They're just stage direction. The very first written words, the very first stage direction is thunder and lightning enter three witches. And the reason I think this is one of the most important parts of the play, or thematically one of the most important parts to pay attention to, is it immediately, with the very first words, enters this uh, debate between the natural and the supernatural. Thunder and lightning and three witches. And sometimes, if I don't do this for the whole year like I did this year, I'll do this for this book. I'll try to ask the kids who they think is in charge in general, and then periodically throughout the story. Um, I did that this year, and it was sort of like each text offered a different answer to that question. And I think that these opening words, or this opening stage direction, thunder, lightning, and three witches, sort of frames this conversation. Sorry, I had a, I found a little tick on me. I guess I went for a walk this morning and it must have clung on, so that threw me off there. So this idea between the natural and the supernatural, who's in charge or what's in charge. In Macbeth, um, first scene, you get these three witches talking about meeting Macbeth after the battle. Second scene, um, this captain reports essentially about the valor of Macbeth in the battlefield and Banquo. And then in the third scene, the witches meet up with Banquo and Macbeth, and give them this prophecy that Macbeth will become king. Um, Actually, that he'll become Thane of Glamis, which he already is, then Cawdor, which he almost gets immediately, and then become king. So he gets these. I think the words are two truths, and two truths, and then as I think as Lady Macbeth says, it's two truths as the happy prologue to the swelling act of the imperial theme, or something like that. That doesn't count as one of my lines. And in that third scene, they meet Macbeth, and they kind of send the whole drama underway. Um, and so I'll ask the kids, who is in charge? Is it the witches or is it Macbeth? Who has agency, etc. There's all sorts to be said about what the witches represent. They're referred to as the weird sisters, as we saw up here, and the way that that's spelled, I think, comes from this word, which just means veered, or sort of means fate, which is interesting. Whoops, fate. Which is interesting because we kind of use that word the same way, right? If you bump into somebody and you haven't seen them in a while, maybe you're just talking about them, you'll say that it was weird. Um, not to say necessarily that it was strange, but almost as if it were fated. Sometimes we use that word that way. These three witches are often said to sort of represent the three fates. And in some ways, they seem to determine or be determining Macbeth's fate. And you get this, of course, and the kids will argue about whether or not Macbeth has any agency and what exactly the witches tap into. And you get that debate at the very beginning of the play with Thunder and Lightning enter three witches. And I guess if I could just say, we can come back to this. I can say one more thing about this debate, but a lot of this feels like the witches are running the show. And then I guess a more nuanced interpretation, or the more you sort of look at it, you realize that Macbeth is actually uh, both painfully ambitious and insecure. And they seem almost as much as this to be driving the show. And while this supernatural thing seems to sometimes be in charge, um, it might be the steering wheel, so to speak. Ambition and insecurity seems to be the motor, and those things seem extremely natural, if not sort of in everybody. Okay, um, and these won't be my lines, but there's other hints about whether or not some the things, the events in the play are natural or unnatural. You have the old man talking to Ross and saying, describing all these unnatural events, and then saying that you know these the children of Duncan were framed for killing Duncan, and whether or not that's natural or not. All right, so you get this natural versus supernatural. Who's in charge? The next line is from Duncan. You have Malcolm talking about Malcolm is Duncan's son. He's the prince. You have Malcolm talking about um, the Thane of Cawdor being a traitor. And what's interesting is Macbeth and Banquo were just told, that they were going to become king in some capacity. Um, and you have Malcolm talking about this traitor. And then you have Duncan saying there's no art to find the mind's construction in the face. He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust. He's referring to the Thane of Cawdor. And then again, these stage directions are pretty clever. Enter Macbeth, Banquo, Ross, and Angus. And he says, "Oh, word, this is still Duncan. Oh, worthy his cousin, the sin of my ingratitude, even now, is heavy on me." While this is a play, of course, about who's in charge, the natural, the supernatural, it's also a play about deception. And you have here Duncan sort of framing it. There's this really, I think we call it dramatic irony. We know something that Duncan doesn't know. And that's that Macbeth is having these thoughts already in whatever scene this is. Scene 4. Macbeth is already having these, if not treacherous, then he's having these ambitions that are going to start to conflict with Duncan's position. And you have this sort of conflict between what's being presented and what actually is. And Lady Macbeth later will say things like, act like the flower, but be the serpent underneath it. Smile and be gracious, but then in your heart of hearts, be villainous and do what you need to do. I think there's one, act like the times. To beguile the time, look like the time. Bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. He that's coming must be provided for, and you shall put this night's great business into my dispatch, which shall to all our nights and days to come give solely sovereign sway and masterdom. Okay, so there's no art. That's the second line. The third is Macbeth writes a letter. This is Act 1, Scene 5. He writes a letter to Lady Macbeth, and Scene 5, the first time we meet Lady Macbeth, it opens with her reading this letter. They met me the day of success, and this is the day of success being the day they won the battle, and I've learned by the perfectest report they have more in them than mortal knowledge, etc., etc. He's telling them about the weird sisters, or the three witches. And then Lady Macbeth has this soliloquy that's pretty wild. She's reflecting on the letter, and she says, "Glams thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised." Thane of Glams, you already are. Cawdor, you were just given, and what you're promised, according to her interpretation of the letter, which is Macbeth's interpretation of the interaction with the witches, is that he'll become king. Glams thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised. And the second line that we see, first of all, I probably didn't mention this enough to my students, but she never says anything about like, "Oh my God, thank God you're okay, thank God we won." Her first lines are about ambition. You're going to be this, and her second line is, "Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way." She is doubting immediately that he has what it takes. That is, Macbeth has what it takes to take what she interprets to be his already. It's already promised to him. Too full of the milk of human kindness. She does a lot with milk. We might see that in a second. That wouldst be great are not without ambition, but without the illness that should attend it. You would be awesome, and you want to be king. You want to be an awesome king, but you don't have that thing. You don't have that meanness to sort of take it. What thou wouldst highly, thou wouldst wholly, wouldst not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. She's sort of saying, like, everybody's cheating. You kind of have to play the game. If you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough, is sort of her sentiment. Um, so she has all, here is pretty much her fear, right? And then the line that I chose is, for my third line, is, "Hie thee hither. that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valor of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear. Hie thee hither, come here, or bring yourself here, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valor of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round. You were promised this thing. I'm afraid you're not going to have what it takes to get it. So come here and let me encourage you to do what's necessary to get rid of everything that's going to stop you from claiming what's yours. So, our 3 lines so far: thunder and lightning and our 3 witches. There's no art. I forget the full line, but essentially one about deception and reading deception in people's faces, and then hie thee hither. So Macbeth was promised this thing. Duncan's the king now, and he trusts Macbeth. And Lady Macbeth is essentially saying, I'm going to be that voice in your head that you don't yet have. Okay. All right, this is probably jumping ahead the furthest. The 3 witches, it turns out, we find this out, I think, in Act 3. It turns out the 3 witches have a boss. So they themselves, if you're going to say that they're in charge, uh, the burden of proof is on you to explain away their boss. Although you might have an interesting argument, because when we first see the boss, Hecate, um, the sort of goddess of witchcraft and potions and things, she's frustrated with the 3 witches because they've kind of been going rogue and out on their own. So you might have something there. When we meet her, she goes on this big long soliloquy about how they didn't include her, and how she's frustrated, and that it was going to happen anyway, but now you've kind of screwed it up, and now it's getting really bloody. And Hecate has this line, and you all know security is mortal's chiefest enemy. And even if there wasn't a really interesting interpretation of security, which there is, this would be a really cool line. Particularly modern, it would require a certain modern interpretation, but it turns out that in the footnotes, that the way security is being meant here is self-confidence, like securities, like self-assurance or security, or being secure in your own decision. So too much self-confidence is mortal's chiefest enemy. And so finally there's a turning point. This is sort of the turning point in the play, philosophically or thematically, where Macbeth is given this lofty ambition through way of the 3 witches. And he sort of aspires to it. He wants it. Lady Macbeth says, hey, look, this is how we get it. Don't wait the long way. We can take some shortcuts here. We can kill Duncan and we can get it. So you have this sort of boundless ambition, right? Finally, through the voice of Hecate, we have this counterpoint, which is great. You have this really high ambition, but does that ambition necessitate a degree of self-confidence that's actually dangerous? And Hecate's words exactly are, you all know that security or too much self-confidence is mortal's chiefest enemy. So now you have another conflict where you have this ambition and this debate about how to go about achieving your ambition in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and killing Duncan and trying to keep off all the other political rivals, Malcolm, Banquo, etc. And on the other hand, right, is being too self-confident a problem? where, according to Lady Macbeth, sort of, not in so many words, but one interpretation would be that she's essentially saying you need to have more self confidence, and now Hecate's finally like, actually, self confidence is a problem, and you're going to cause problems if you have too much self confidence. That's the third line, or the fourth line, sorry. All right. I'm going to flip some things around. When we first meet the witches, they have this really famous line where they all say together, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and fill the air." And then when we meet Macbeth, just a few lines later, a drum, Macbeth doth come. Macbeth says, on the moment that he's going, sort of in the moments preceding meeting the witches for the first time, he says, "So foul and fair day I have not seen." So fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and fill the air. And so foul and fair day I have not seen. What does that mean? Um, I guess literally it's one of those days where you can't tell if it's a nice day or not a nice day. But figuratively and thematically, what's really important is that Macbeth can't tell. I think this is when we meet Macbeth. It has to be. Yeah. When we first meet Macbeth, we in the very first line, "So foul and fair day I have not seen," we are introduced to a character who's conflicted in his interpretation. He does not know if it's a nice day or not a nice day. And this theme carries out actually. He gets the prophecy from the witches, and then Banquo, sorry, his companion, says, "Good sir, why do you start and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? In the name of truth, blah blah blah." Banquo asks for his. Um, so it sounds good. Why do you seem so afraid of it? And then I forget exactly when this happens, but Macbeth has this little side. Okay. He's granted Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, so the first two prophecies have come true, and now he's a little startled. And Macbeth's already starting to buy into it. The greatest is behind. Banquo and him go back and forth. Don't you want this to happen? Etc., etc. And Macbeth has this aside. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. I shouldn't have done that. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion, whose horrid image doth unfix my hair, and make my seated heart knock at my ribs against the use of nature? Okay. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. So fair, foul day I have not seen, and now good or ill. If ill, why is it coming true? Or why are the first two things true and good for me? And if bad, I'm sorry, if good rather, why am I so nervous? Why is the hair on my neck standing up? Why am I so freaked out by this? So my fifth line is this fair's foul line, or this fair foul motif, this good evil. It's essentially a question or a motif of interpretation. Um, Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this prophecy the truth or not? Should I believe and should I subscribe immediately when the witches say that this is going to happen? Should I stake everything? Am I willing to sacrifice other people? Am I willing to sacrifice potentially my reputation? Um, Lady Macbeth says yes immediately, right? Macbeth is constantly, for the first couple acts at least, up until and even after he kills Duncan. Sorry, spoiler alert. He is a little conflicted as to whether or not um, one interpretation is better than the other. Those are the 5 lines. I think that really begins to sum up, or at least frame thematically, Macbeth. I think if I had to sort of punctuate it, and maybe this is another video, but Macbeth and Lady Macbeth start to switch in a really cool way that reminds me of Ray and Gerard. But they start to copy each other, and they actually invert, where Mac- Lady Macbeth is kind of wearing the pants at first, and Macbeth is really nervous and scared and troubled by what he has to do to become king. And then gradually they switch. Um, and they switch almost completely, where there's some of that they trade some of the same lines, and they certainly trade some of the same neuroses. Um, Lady Macbeth eventually is so troubled by what they have to do that she not only dies, but she takes her own life. Macbeth uh, is sort of holding on to these subsequent prophecies that he gets that are really reassuring, to reference back to Hecate's line, that give him more self confidence, and that self confidence, it turns out, is wrongly placed. His final interpretation, before, again, spoiler alert, his head is cut off. His final interpretation is a speech known as the Tomorrow speech. This whole play is trying to interpret events, and then at the end of the play, towards the end of the play, when Lady Macbeth finally kills herself, he then interprets all of life, and he oscillates the entire play from sort of like good and bad, and then at the end, fully goes to sort of this like nihilistic worldview. So let's see, tomorrow. All right, Lady Macbeth is announced dead, and these are Macbeth's words. I might be able to recite this actually. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale, excuse me, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. There's a quick plug. Out, out is the name of a really cool Robert Frost poem that alludes to this interpretation. But he essentially says, all of our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets. Life is this visiting actor that worries and tries really hard and uh, works himself into a tizzy about doing this and doing that, and then is heard no more. It is a tale, this is a life, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So, in the final interpretation, according to Macbeth, the character, life is meaningless. And again, yeah, that's definitely more than 5 lines or whatever, but I think that meaninglessness, or that interpretation of meaninglessness, is, at least in my interpretation, the punctuation at the end of this debate of whether or not these events are fair or foul, good or ill, good or bad, etc. Um, Macbeth is constantly oscillating, and he goes from extreme to extreme, and at the very end, sort of dips into this nihilistic extreme, where you know, I guess 25% on, 25% of the way through and on, after Lady Macbeth kind of gets in his head, he's like, "Oh, all of this is good. This is 100% good for me," and kind of loses that the benefit of that reservation that he might have had at the beginning. He goes from being 100% positive in his interpretation to 100% negative and deeply nihilistic, as you see in this speech. Um, Again, I don't think that that is exhaustive in the interpretation of Macbeth. Clearly not. Um, but I think those 5 lines do a really good job. 6, whatever, do a really good job of sort of framing thematically some of the most interesting parts of it, at least interesting to me.